At 11:47 on the morning of March 18, 1944, Second Lieutenant James Robert Connolly slumped forward in the pilot's seat of B-24 Liberator Lucky Strike, bleeding from 17 separate wounds across his chest and neck, while his bomber continued flying straight and level at 22,000 feet over occupied France. 23 years old, from Cedar Rapids, Iowa, 12 combat missions completed. This would be his last. Behind him, 9 crew members worked at their stations, unaware that the man controlling their aircraft had been dead for 4 minutes. The autopilot system, engaged 30 seconds before German cannon fire tore through the cockpit, would fly the bomber for the next 200 miles. Lucky Strike carried 2,700 gallons of aviation fuel, 5,000 pounds of bombs already released over the target at Augsburg, and enough momentum to reach England if nothing else went wrong. But everything was about to go wrong. The mission briefing at RAF Shipdham had started at 0430 hours. The 44th Bombardment Group would join 738 other bombers attacking German aircraft manufacturing facilities across southern Germany. Augsburg was one of 4 primary targets that morning. Intelligence estimated 200 Luftwaffe fighters defending the area. The weather forecast predicted heavy cloud cover over the target and clear skies over France on the return flight. Clear skies meant visibility. Visibility meant fighters could find stragglers. Connolly had studied the maps during the briefing. The route would take them across the English Channel, over occupied France, across the Rhine River into Germany, then reverse the path home. Total mission time, 6 hours. The briefing officer had emphasized one critical point. Stay in formation. A bomber alone was a dead bomber. The 44th had already lost 16 aircraft in February. 42 missions flown, 16 bombers destroyed, 160 men killed or captured. The mathematics were brutal. Statistical analysis showed that bomber crews had a 25% chance of completing their required 25 missions. 3 out of 4 crews would die or be captured before going home. Connolly had enlisted in June 1942, 2 days after graduating from Washington High School. His father operated a hardware store in Cedar Rapids. His mother taught piano lessons. His younger brother was still in school. Connolly had wanted to fly since watching barnstormers perform at the county fair when he was 8 years old. The Army Air Forces needed pilots. Connolly had the aptitude scores and the physical fitness. They sent him to primary flight training at Thunderbird Field in Arizona, then basic training at Goodfellow Field in Texas, then advanced training at Lubbock. He earned his wings in March 1943 and transitioned to heavy bombers at Smyrna, Tennessee. The B-24 Liberator was not an easy aircraft to fly. It was heavier than the B-17, faster in level flight, but more difficult to control. Pilots called it the flying coffin, because it burned easily when hit. The fuel tanks were not self-sealing like those on the B-17. One tracer round in the right place could turn a B-24 into a fireball. Lucky Strike took off from Shipdham at 6:15, forming up with 23 other aircraft from the 44th Bombardment Group. The bomber stream assembled over East Anglia, then turned southeast toward France. The formation crossed the English Channel at 0742. Below them, the grey water disappeared beneath scattered clouds. Ahead lay the French coast and 5 hours of flying through the most heavily defended airspace in Europe. The co-pilot that morning was Second Lieutenant Robert Martinez from El Paso, Texas. 22 years old, 8 missions completed. Martinez handled the radio communications and monitored the engine instruments, while Connolly flew the aircraft. The B-24 required constant attention. The controls were heavy. The aircraft wanted to drift left due to engine torque. Maintaining position in formation demanded continuous small corrections to throttle and control surfaces. The navigator, Second Lieutenant David Chen from San Francisco, worked at his station behind the cockpit. His job was tracking their position using dead reckoning, radio navigation, and celestial shots when the sun was visible. The bombardier, Second Lieutenant William Foster from Atlanta, sat in the nose section forward of Chen. Foster would take control of the aircraft during the bomb run, using the Norden bomb site to guide Lucky Strike to the release point. The flight engineer, Technical Sergeant John Murphy from Boston, occupied the top turret position directly behind the cockpit. Murphy monitored all mechanical systems, watched for engine fires, and operated the twin 50-caliber machine guns mounted in the turret. The radio operator, Staff Sergeant Thomas Wilson from Chicago, sat behind Murphy with his radio equipment and code books. Wilson maintained contact with command, received weather updates, and would transmit distress signals if the aircraft went down. The waist gunners, Staff Sergeant Robert Davis and Staff Sergeant James Mitchell, stood at open windows on either side of the fuselage, operating 50-caliber machine guns on flexible mounts. The temperature at altitude was 40 degrees below zero. The waist gunners wore heated suits, oxygen masks, and watched the sky for enemy fighters through frost-covered goggles. The ball turret gunner, Staff Sergeant Eugene Parker from Detroit, hung beneath the aircraft in a plexiglass sphere, operating two 50-caliber guns. The ball turret was the most vulnerable position on a B-24. If the landing gear failed, the ball turret would be crushed on landing. Parker could not wear a parachute while inside the turret. If the bomber went down, he had to climb out first. The tail gunner, Staff Sergeant Harold Wright from Philadelphia, sat in the rear of the aircraft, isolated from the rest of the crew by 40 feet of fuselage. His twin 50 calibers protected the bomber's most exposed angle. The formation reached German airspace at 10:15. The Luftwaffe appeared at 10:31. Messerschmitt Bf 109s and Focke-Wulf 190s rose from airfields across southern Germany to intercept the American bombers. The fighters attacked in waves, diving through the bomber formations, firing 20mm cannons and 13mm machine guns, then breaking away to reposition for another pass. Lucky Strike's gunners tracked the fighters, firing short bursts when targets came within range. The intercom filled with voices calling out positions. Fighter, 3 o'clock high. 2 bandits, 6 o'clock low. FW coming in from 11 o'clock. The smell of cordite from the machine guns filled the fuselage. Spent brass casings piled up on the floor. The formation tightened as bombers maneuvered to maintain mutual defensive fire. The first B-24 went down at 10:47. A Focke-Wulf hit the number 2 engine with cannon fire. The engine exploded. Fire spread across the wing. The bomber fell out of formation, trailing smoke and flames. 6 parachutes emerged before the aircraft exploded. 3 crew members never got out. At 11:03, another bomber took hits to the cockpit. The pilot was killed instantly. The co-pilot managed to keep the aircraft flying long enough for the crew to bail out. 8 parachutes. 2 men stayed with the aircraft, either dead or unable to reach the exits. The formation was 18 minutes from the target when the fighters broke off. German fighter pilots had learned not to press attacks near heavily defended targets. The anti-aircraft batteries did not distinguish between friend and enemy. If the fighters stayed close to the bombers over the target, they risked being shot down by their own flak. If you want to see how a dead pilot flew his crew home and what happened when they discovered the truth after landing, please hit that like button. Subscribe for more untold stories from World War II. Back to Connolly. Augsburg appeared through broken clouds at 11:21. The city's anti-aircraft defences opened fire immediately. Black bursts of flak filled the sky around the bomber formation. Each burst represented an 88mm shell exploding at a predetermined altitude, sending thousands of steel fragments in every direction. Flak could not be evaded. The bombers had to fly straight and level during the bomb run. The bombardiers needed stable platforms to aim their Norden bomb sights accurately. Any deviation would cause the bombs to miss the target. Connolly held Lucky Strike steady despite the explosions bracketing his aircraft. Shrapnel struck the fuselage, punching holes in the aluminum skin. One fragment tore through the number 3 engine cowling. Oil began streaming from the damaged engine. Murphy reported the problem over the intercom. The engine was still running, but losing oil pressure. If the pressure dropped too far, the engine would seize. A seized engine could tear itself apart, potentially taking the wing with it. Foster took control of the aircraft through the Norden bomb site at 11:24. He called out minor course corrections. Left, steady, right, steady. The bomb site was computing the aircraft's speed, altitude and drift, calculating the precise moment to release the bombs. Foster watched the target markers come into view: aircraft hangars, assembly buildings, machine shops, all legitimate military targets under the laws of war. At 1:11:27:34, Foster pressed the release. 5,000 pounds of high-explosive bombs fell from Lucky Strike's bomb bay. The sudden weight loss caused the aircraft to rise several hundred feet. Connolly pushed the nose down to maintain formation altitude. Behind them, the bombs tumbled through 18,000 feet of air, impacting the target 27 seconds after release. Foster reported "bombs away" over the intercom. The mission's primary objective was complete. Now they just had to survive the flight home. The formation turned west at 11:29, heading back toward France. The German fighters were waiting. They had used the time during the bomb run to reposition, to refuel, to rearm. Fresh fighters joined those that had attacked during the inbound leg. Intelligence estimates would later count over 120 separate fighter sorties against the Augsburg raid that day. The attacks resumed at 11:36. This time the fighters concentrated on stragglers and damaged aircraft. Lucky Strike was neither. The bomber held its position in the formation. All 4 engines were running. The crew had not reported any serious damage. But the Luftwaffe was not selective. They attacked any bomber they could reach. 2 Messerschmitt Bf 109s dove on Lucky Strike from the 1 o'clock high position. They came in fast, nearly 400 miles per hour, firing 20mm cannons from 600 yards out. Most of their rounds missed. Most. 3 20mm shells struck the nose section. The plexiglass shattered. Foster was killed instantly. Chen was wounded, fragments in his shoulder and left arm. The freezing air rushed through the destroyed nose, dropping the temperature to 60 below zero in seconds. Chen grabbed his first aid kit and tried to stop the bleeding. Murphy spotted the Messerschmitts as they pulled away and tracked them with his top turret. He got off a 3-second burst before they were out of range. No hits. The fighters would circle around and attack again. Another B-24 in the formation took cannon fire to the wing route. The inboard fuel tank exploded. The bomber rolled inverted and fell out of formation. No parachutes. 10 men dead. At 11:42, a Focke-Wulf 190 attacked Lucky Strike from the 6 o'clock position. Wright, the tail gunner, opened fire at 500 yards. His tracers walked across the sky toward the approaching fighter. The FW-190 pressed its attack, firing its twin 20mm cannons and 2 13mm machine guns. 23 rounds struck Lucky Strike's tail section. 4 rounds hit Wright. He died at his guns. The remaining rounds tore through control cables and the rudder structure. Connolly felt the rudder controls go mushy. The pedals moved, but the aircraft didn't respond properly. He tried to compensate with the ailerons. The B-24 was still flying, still holding formation, but the handling had degraded significantly. Murphy reported the tail damage over the intercom. Wright was not responding. Martinez tried calling him on the intercom. Nothing. They would not know Wright was dead until after landing, if they landed. The formation was over France now, heading west toward the English Channel. The German fighters were still attacking. Another bomber went down at 11:48. Direct hit to the cockpit. The pilot and co-pilot were killed. The aircraft entered a spin. Several crew members bailed out. The bomber crashed near Strasbourg. At 11:51, a Messerschmitt Bf 109 attacked Lucky Strike from the 11 o'clock high position. The fighter pilot had chosen his angle carefully. He was diving out of the sun, using the glare to mask his approach until the last possible moment. Martinez saw him first. He called it out over the intercom, but there was no time for the top turret to traverse. The Messerschmitt fired from 300 yards. The 20mm cannon shells walked up the left side of the cockpit. The first shell struck the instrument panel. The second shell hit Martinez in the chest, killing him instantly. The third, fourth, and fifth shells struck Connolly. The fragments tore through his flight suit, through his flak vest, through his body. 17 separate wounds across his chest, shoulders, and neck. Blood sprayed across the cockpit. Connolly's hands fell from the control yoke. His head dropped forward. Second Lieutenant James Robert Connolly died at 11:51:47 on March 18, 1944. Lucky Strike continued flying straight and level. The autopilot was engaged. 30 seconds before the attack, Connolly had engaged the autopilot system. The B-24's autopilot was a mechanical device that maintained the aircraft's heading, altitude, and attitude without pilot input. It used gyroscopes and servos connected to the control surfaces. The system was not sophisticated by modern standards, but it worked. With the autopilot engaged, the bomber would continue flying on its current heading until the fuel ran out or someone turned it off. Murphy, in the top turret position, did not immediately realize what had happened in the cockpit. He was focused on tracking enemy fighters. The top turret faced backward. Murphy could not see the pilot and co-pilot seats from his position. Chen was in the nose section, wounded and trying to treat his own injuries. He could not see the cockpit from his position either. The waist gunners, Davis and Mitchell, were firing at fighters attacking other bombers in the formation. They could not see the cockpit. Parker, in the ball turret beneath the aircraft, had no visibility into the cockpit. Wilson, the radio operator, sat behind Murphy with his radio equipment blocking his view forward. None of the surviving crew members knew that both pilots were dead. Lucky Strike continued flying in formation. From the outside, the bomber appeared normal. It held its position. It maintained altitude. The formation began a gradual turn to the southwest at 12:03, following the planned route. Lucky Strike did not turn with the formation. The autopilot kept the bomber flying straight ahead on its original heading. By 12:05, Lucky Strike had drifted away from the group. Murphy noticed the problem at 12:07. He looked out from his turret and saw that the other bombers were no longer in their usual positions. Lucky Strike had separated from the formation. He tried calling Connolly on the intercom. No response. He tried calling Martinez. No response. Murphy secured his turret, climbed down from his position and moved forward to the cockpit. What he saw stopped him cold. Martinez was slumped in the co-pilot seat, clearly dead. Connolly was forward in the pilot seat, unmoving. Murphy reached forward and checked for a pulse. Nothing. Both pilots were dead. The bomber was flying on autopilot, and they were alone, separated from the formation, over occupied France. Murphy's training had covered many emergency situations. This was not one of them. He grabbed the intercom and called Wilson. "Radio, flight engineer, get up here now." Wilson climbed out of his station and made his way forward. He saw the dead pilots and immediately understood the situation. Murphy and Wilson had a problem. Neither of them was a pilot. Murphy had some basic stick time from orientation flights. Wilson had none. The B-24 required 2 pilots for normal operations. Taking off and landing were particularly difficult. The bomber was heavy, the controls were stiff, and the aircraft had a tendency to ground loop if not handled correctly. But Murphy and Wilson had no choice. They could not leave the dead pilots in their seats. They could not reach the controls with the bodies in the way. And Lucky Strike was running out of altitude. The autopilot maintained heading, but not altitude precisely. The bomber was descending slowly, losing about 50 feet per minute. Murphy and Wilson pulled Martinez's body out of the co-pilot seat first. They moved him back into the bomb bay, laying him on the catwalk. Then they removed Connolly's body from the pilot seat. The control yoke was slippery with blood. They laid Connolly next to Martinez and returned to the cockpit. Murphy climbed into the pilot seat. His hands and flight suit were covered in blood. He wiped them on his pant legs and grabbed the control yoke. Wilson took the co-pilot seat. Neither man knew how to fly a B-24. Murphy had watched pilots operate the controls. He understood the basic theory. Push the yoke forward, the nose goes down. Pull back, the nose comes up. Turn the yoke left, the aircraft banks left. But understanding theory and actually flying were different things. The autopilot was still engaged. Murphy studied the instruments. Airspeed, 180 miles per hour. Altitude, 21,400 feet. Heading, 267 degrees. The engine sounded normal. The fuel gauges showed adequate reserves. The oil pressures were in the green range except for number 3 engine, which was still losing oil from the damage over the target. Murphy made a decision. He would leave the autopilot engaged. The system was doing a better job than he could. His responsibility was to monitor the instruments and make sure nothing catastrophic happened. If an engine failed, he would have to deal with it. If the fuel ran low, he would have to find a place to land. But for now, The best course of action was to let the autopilot do its job. Wilson tried raising the formation on the radio. He called the group leader. No response. He tried other frequencies. Nothing. They were too far from the formation to maintain radio contact. Wilson switched to the distress frequency and transmitted a call. Any Allied station, this is Lucky Strike, B-24, alone over France, both pilots dead, requesting assistance. He repeated the call 3 times. No response. They were on their own. Murphy called Chen on the intercom. Navigator, we need a heading to England. Chen, still bleeding from his wounds, looked at his maps. He calculated their position based on the last known heading and estimated airspeed. Without proper navigation instruments, and with his shoulder injury, the calculations were rough. But Chen came up with a heading, 285 degrees, northwest toward the English Channel. Murphy disconnected the autopilot. The moment he did, Lucky Strike began to drift. The nose dropped. The aircraft banked slightly to the left. Murphy pulled back on the yoke and turned the wheel right. He overcorrected. The nose came up too far. The aircraft banked too far right. Murphy compensated again. Too much input. The bomber wallowed through the sky like a drunk man trying to walk a straight line. Wilson grabbed the co-pilot's control yoke. Smaller movements, he said. Easy inputs. Murphy tried again. Gentle pressure back on the yoke. Small turn of the wheel. Lucky Strike stabilized somewhat. Murphy managed to get the aircraft turned to 285 degrees. Then he re-engaged the autopilot. The bomber steadied. Murphy was shaking. His hands were trembling from adrenaline and fear. He had just flown a B-24 for the first time in his life. The fact that the maneuvers were crude and dangerous was irrelevant. He had kept the aircraft in the air. Chen provided updates on their estimated position every 15 minutes. By 12:40, they had crossed into Allied-held airspace over eastern France. The immediate danger of German fighters had decreased. But they still faced significant problems. They had no escort. They were flying alone at an altitude where they were visible for dozens of miles. German fighters could still intercept them if they were spotted, and they had to navigate to England without proper instruments or trained pilots. The weather began deteriorating at 12:57. Cloud layers appeared below them. Chen tried to calculate their position using dead reckoning, but the margin of error was increasing. They could be 10 miles north of their estimated position. They could be 20 miles south. Without visual landmarks, Chen was navigating blind. Murphy kept the autopilot engaged and monitored the engines. The number 3 engine was still losing oil. The pressure had dropped to 20 pounds per square inch. Normal operating pressure was 45. If the pressure dropped below 15, the engine would seize. Murphy had 2 options. He could shut down the engine now to prevent it from destroying itself, or he could keep it running and accept the risk of a catastrophic failure. He chose to keep it running. Lucky Strike needed all 4 engines to maintain altitude with its current fuel load. The bomber carried no bombs, but it still weighed over 50,000 pounds with fuel and ammunition. Murphy watched the oil pressure gauge like it was a ticking time bomb. 20 pounds. 19. 18. At 13:19, the number 3 engine's oil pressure hit 15 pounds per square inch. Murphy made the decision. He pulled the mixture control to idle cutoff and the throttle to closed. The propeller began windmilling. Then Murphy pressed the feathering button. The propeller blades rotated to present their edges to the airflow, stopping the windmilling and reducing drag. The engine was shut down. Lucky Strike shuddered as the power dropped. The aircraft wanted to yaw to the right. The autopilot compensated, adding rudder trim to counteract the asymmetric thrust. Murphy increased power on the remaining 3 engines to maintain altitude and airspeed. The bomber was now flying on 3 engines over northern France with no trained pilot and no confirmed position. Chen updated his navigation estimate at 13:30. If his calculations were correct, they should reach the French coast in approximately 20 minutes. From there, they would cross the English Channel and reach the British coast in another 40 minutes. But if his calculations were wrong, they could miss England entirely and fly out over the Atlantic until the fuel ran out. Wilson continued transmitting distress calls on multiple frequencies. At 13:47, He finally received a response. A British radar station had picked up Lucky Strike's transponder signal. The station confirmed their position was approximately 30 miles south of where Chen had estimated. The British controller provided a corrected heading, 295 degrees. Murphy disconnected the autopilot, turned the bomber to the new heading, and re-engaged the autopilot. The controller also provided weather information. Heavy cloud cover over the English Channel. Visibility less than 1 mile below 2,000 feet. The bomber would have to descend through clouds to find the ground. Murphy had never flown on instruments. Wilson had never flown at all. Landing a B-24 in poor visibility required skill that neither man possessed. The British controller seemed to understand the situation. He asked Wilson a direct question. "Are either of you trained pilots?" Wilson responded, "Negative. Both pilots are dead. Flight engineer is flying the aircraft." There was a long pause. Then the controller's voice came back, calm and professional. "Understood. We will guide you to RAF Manston. The field has emergency crash equipment standing by." Manston was on the coast of Kent, with long runways designed for emergency landings. The British had positioned fire trucks, ambulances and rescue crews. They were preparing for the worst. The controller guided Murphy through the descent. "Reduce power. Begin descending at 500 feet per minute. Maintain current heading." Murphy pulled the throttles back slightly. The bomber began descending. The rate of descent was too fast. Murphy adjusted. Too slow. He adjusted again. By the time Lucky Strike descended through 10,000 feet, Murphy had developed a rough feel for the power settings needed to control the descent rate. The aircraft entered clouds at 8,000 feet. Murphy had no training in instrument flying. He tried to keep the wings level using the artificial horizon. The instrument showed a small aircraft symbol against a representation of the horizon. If the wings stayed level, the aircraft flew straight. If the wings tilted, the aircraft turned. Murphy watched the instrument and made small corrections. The bomber descended through layer after layer of clouds. At 2,000 feet, they broke into clear air. Below them was the English Channel. Grey water stretched to the horizon. Ahead, the coast of England was visible through the haze. The controller provided the next instruction. "You are 20 miles from Manston. Begin turning to heading 310 degrees for final approach." Murphy disconnected the autopilot and began the turn. The bomber banked left. Too steep, he corrected. The wings came level too early. Lucky Strike had only turned 15 degrees. Murphy started the turn again. This time he held the bank until the compass showed 310. Then he leveled the wings. The bomber was lined up with the approach course, more or less. The controller confirmed, "You are slightly left of centerline, but close enough. Continue descent to 1,500 feet. Reduce speed to 140 miles per hour." Murphy pulled the throttles back and pushed the nose down. The airspeed decreased. The altimeter unwound. 5,000 feet. 4,000. 3,000. At 1,500 feet, Murphy leveled off and stabilized the airspeed at 140 miles per hour. Wilson was watching ahead through the co-pilot's window. He saw the runway in the distance. 2 miles away, maybe less. The runway looked small, impossibly small for a bomber weighing 50,000 pounds. The controller continued providing guidance. "Begin final descent. Reduce speed to 120 miles per hour. Lower landing gear when you have the runway in sight." Murphy reached for the landing gear lever. He pulled it down. 3 green lights illuminated on the instrument panel, indicating all 3 landing gear assemblies were locked in the down position. Lucky Strike was committed to landing. The bomber descended through 1,000 feet. Murphy tried to keep the nose pointed at the runway. The aircraft drifted left. He corrected. Too much. The bomber drifted right. He corrected again. At 500 feet, Murphy realized they were too high and too fast. The normal approach speed for a B-24 was 110 miles per hour. They were indicating 125. The bomber was going to overshoot the runway. Wilson suggested pulling the throttles to idle and letting the aircraft descend faster. Murphy did. The nose dropped. The descent rate increased to 1,000 feet per minute. Too fast. Lucky Strike was falling more than flying. Murphy pulled back on the yoke to arrest the descent. The nose came up. The airspeed decreased. The bomber was now too slow. The controls felt mushy. They were approaching stall speed. Murphy pushed the yoke forward. The nose dropped. The airspeed increased. The bomber was 50 feet above the runway threshold when Murphy pulled back on the yoke one last time. Lucky Strike slammed onto the runway with the impact of a controlled crash. The main landing gear absorbed most of the shock, but the nose wheel hit hard. The tire burst. The wheel rim dug into the concrete. The bomber veered left. Murphy tried to correct using the rudder pedals. The bomber veered right. Wilson suggested cutting power to the engines. Murphy pulled all 3 throttle levers to idle. The propellers went into flat pitch. The bomber slowed. The veering became less severe. Lucky Strike rolled another 1,200 feet before stopping on the grass beside the runway. Fire trucks and ambulances raced toward the bomber. Murphy sat in the pilot's seat, hands still gripping the control yoke, breathing heavily. He had just landed a B-24 with no training and no co-pilot. The fact that the landing was terrible was irrelevant. Everyone was alive. The ground crews arrived and opened the waist door. Davis and Mitchell climbed out, followed by Parker and Wilson. Murphy secured the engines and electrical systems before climbing out. Chen needed help getting out due to his shoulder wound. The medics loaded him onto a stretcher. The British flight surgeon examined the crew. Chen was evacuated to the base hospital. Wright's body was removed from the tail position. Martinez and Connolly's bodies were removed from the bomb bay. The British ground crews inspected Lucky Strike. The aircraft had taken over 50 hits from cannon fire and flak. The nose section was destroyed. The tail section was damaged. The rudder controls were barely functional. The number 3 engine was seized. The bomber would never fly again. The debriefing lasted 3 hours. Murphy, Wilson, Davis, Mitchell and Parker each provided statements describing what had happened. The intelligence officer documented every detail. Both pilots killed over France. The flight engineer assuming control. The autopilot flying the bomber for nearly 90 minutes. The crew's survival. The emergency landing at Manston. When asked how he had managed to fly and land the B-24, Murphy said he didn't know. He had done what needed to be done. The alternative was dying over France. The intelligence officer wrote in his report, "Technical Sergeant Murphy demonstrated extraordinary resourcefulness and courage in circumstances for which no training could have prepared him. His actions saved the lives of 7 crew members." The 44th Bombardment Group lost 4 aircraft on the Augsburg mission. 40 men were killed or captured. Lucky Strike was the only aircraft that returned to England with both pilots dead. The mission was considered a success. The bombing had destroyed several aircraft assembly buildings and damaged machine shops, but the cost had been high. 73 bombers lost across all target areas. 730 men. The 8th Air Force was hemorrhaging crews faster than replacements could be trained. The strategic bombing campaign was approaching a crisis point. Murphy received the Distinguished Flying Cross for his actions on March 18th. The citation recognized his decision to take control of the bomber and his successful navigation to England, despite having no pilot training. Wilson received the Air Medal for his radio work coordinating the emergency landing. Chen received the Purple Heart for his wounds and the Air Medal for continuing to navigate despite being injured. The other surviving crew members received campaign credits. Wright, Connolly, Martinez and Foster were posthumously awarded the Air Medal and the Purple Heart. Their families received the medals and the telegrams that every family dreaded. "The Secretary of War desires me to express his deep regret that your son was killed in action over France." Murphy flew 6 more combat missions with the 44th Bombardment Group. He transferred to pilot training in June 1944, earning his wings in November. He never spoke about March 18th unless someone asked. When people wanted to know what it was like to fly a bomber with no training, Murphy would say he had been terrified the entire time. He had expected to crash. The fact that everyone survived was luck, not skill. He finished the war with 23 combat missions, 1 Distinguished Flying Cross and 2 Air Medals. He returned to Boston in July 1945, married his high school girlfriend, and worked for the Massachusetts Bay Transportation Authority for 37 years. He died in 1998 at age 76. Chen recovered from his wounds and returned to flying status in June 1944. He completed his remaining missions and returned to San Francisco in September. He attended Stanford University on the GI Bill, graduated with a degree in engineering, and worked for Boeing for 32 years. He helped design the 707 and 747. He retired in 1982 and died in 2007 at age 85. Wilson remained with the 44th Bombardment Group until the war ended. He flew 31 combat missions. He returned to Chicago and opened an electronics repair shop. He died in 1991 at age 70. Davis, Mitchell, and Parker all completed their required missions and returned home in late 1944. None of them ever flew again. Connolly's body was buried at the American Cemetery in Cambridge, England. His parents travelled to England in 1946 to visit the grave. The headstone reads, 2nd Lieutenant James Robert Connolly, pilot, United States Army Air Forces, March 18, 1944, age 23, he gave his life for freedom. His younger brother graduated from high school in 1946 and enlisted in the Air Force. He became a pilot, flying B-29s in Korea. He survived the war and retired as a lieutenant colonel in 1970. He said he became a pilot to honor his brother's memory. Martinez's family held a memorial service in El Paso in April 1944. The service was attended by over 200 people. His parents requested that donations be made to the Army Air Force's Aid Society instead of flowers. Foster's parents received his body in 1948, when the remains were repatriated to the United States. He was buried in Atlanta with full military honors. Wright's family held his funeral in Philadelphia in April 1944. His widow was pregnant at the time. She gave birth to a son in July and named him Harold after his father. Lucky Strike was scrapped at Manston in June 1944. The bomber was too damaged to justify repair. The useful components were salvaged for other aircraft. The rest went to a metal recycling facility. The bomber's nose art, showing a cigarette pack with a pair of dice, was preserved and later donated to the mighty 8th Air Force Museum in Georgia. The art hangs in the museum's B-24 display, one of the few physical artifacts remaining from the aircraft that flew 200 miles with a dead pilot. The autopilot system that kept Lucky Strike flying has been studied by aviation historians and engineers. The mechanical gyroscopes and servos were remarkably reliable. They could maintain heading and altitude for extended periods without human intervention. But the system had limitations. It could not adjust for changes in aircraft weight as fuel burned off. It could not react to emergency situations. It could not land the aircraft. The autopilot could keep the bomber flying straight and level indefinitely, but it could not save the crew. That required human intervention. It required Murphy climbing into a seat slick with blood and taking control of an aircraft he had no business flying. It required Wilson coordinating with British controllers despite having no flight training. It required Chen navigating while bleeding from shrapnel wounds. The story of Lucky Strike was classified during the war. The Army Air Forces did not want newspapers publishing accounts of bombers flying with dead pilots. The psychological impact on families was too great. Imagine reading in the newspaper that your son's bomber flew for 200 miles after the pilots were killed. Imagine the questions that would follow. How long did he suffer? Was he calling for help? Did anyone try to save him? The military decided the story would remain confidential until after the war. By the time the classification was lifted in 1946, most people had moved on. The war was over. Millions of stories competed for attention. A bomber flying with a dead pilot was unusual, but not unique enough to capture public interest when everyone wanted to forget about the war and focus on the future. Aviation safety investigators studied the incident. Their analysis focused on crew training. The report concluded that all bomber crew members should receive basic pilot training. If something happened to the pilots, at least one other crew member should be able to control the aircraft long enough to reach friendly territory. The recommendation was never implemented. Training time was limited. Pilots needed hundreds of hours to become proficient. Expecting engineers and radio operators to develop basic flying skills was unrealistic. The military decided that the situation that occurred on Lucky Strike was so rare that developing training protocols was not cost-effective. The odds of both pilots being killed simultaneously while the autopilot was engaged were extremely low. But it happened at least 3 other times during World War II. A B-17 named Ruthless flew 80 miles over Germany with both pilots dead in July 1944. The top turret gunner took control and crash-landed the bomber near American lines. All surviving crew members were rescued. A B-24 named Desert Warrior flew 120 miles over Libya in 1943 with the pilot dead and the co-pilot incapacitated. The navigator assumed control and landed at a forward airstrip. Another B-17 flew 230 miles over France in August 1944 with both pilots killed. The flight engineer landed the bomber at an emergency airfield in Belgium. In each case, crew members with no formal pilot training managed to keep their aircraft flying long enough to reach safety. The common factor in all these incidents was the autopilot. Without that system, the bombers would have crashed within minutes of the pilots being killed. The autopilot bought time for the crew to assess the situation, time to coordinate with ground controllers, time to attempt an emergency landing. The autopilot could not save the aircraft, but it prevented the immediate loss of control that would occur if both pilots were killed and no one took over the controls. The system was not designed for this purpose. It was designed to reduce pilot workload during long flights. The fact that it could maintain flight with a dead pilot was an unintended benefit. James Robert Connolly never knew his actions saved his crew. He engaged the autopilot 30 seconds before being killed. The decision was routine, made for reasons unrelated to survival. He wanted to reduce the workload during the formation flight. He wanted to focus on managing the damaged engine. He engaged the autopilot, and then he died. That decision gave Murphy the time he needed to reach the cockpit, assess the situation and take control. Without the autopilot, Lucky Strike would have entered a death spiral within seconds of Connolly releasing the controls. The bomber would have crashed into occupied France. No survivors, no emergency landing, no story for anyone to remember. Every pilot makes dozens of decisions during a mission. Most of those decisions have no lasting impact. They are routine, procedural, forgotten as soon as they are made. But occasionally a single decision changes everything. Connolly's decision to engage the autopilot saved 7 lives. He never knew. He was dead before the outcome was determined. The 7 men who survived knew. They knew that if Connolly had not engaged the autopilot, they would have died with him. They knew that his routine decision had become their salvation. Murphy carried that knowledge for 54 years. Every March 18th, he would take out the photograph of Lucky Strike's crew. 10 men standing in front of their bomber, all of them smiling. 4 of them would be dead within hours. Murphy would look at Connolly's face and wonder if the pilot had any sense of what was about to happen, any premonition, any final thought before the cannon shells tore through his body. The answer, of course, was no. Connolly had no warning. He died doing his job, flying his aircraft, protecting his crew. He died at 23 years old, 5 months after arriving in England, 12 missions into a tour that required 25. He had 13 missions remaining. He would never fly them. His parents would never see him again. His younger brother would spend the rest of his life trying to live up to a memory. And 7 men would spend the rest of their lives knowing they survived, because a dead man's hand had engaged an autopilot switch 30 seconds before his death. If this story moved you the way it moved us, do me a favor. Hit that like button. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten stories from dusty archives every single day. Stories about bomber crews who survived against impossible odds, real people, real heroism. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you're watching from. Are you watching from the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia? Our community stretches across the entire world. You're not just a viewer. You're part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served. Just let us know you're here. Thank you for watching, and thank you for making sure James Robert Connolly doesn't disappear into silence. These men deserve to be remembered, and you're helping make that happen.